Hello, welcome to chapter 3, in which we'll talk about carbon and the molecules that are made up primarily of carbon. So, in this chapter, we sort of start to transition between the chemistry that we were talking about before and biology. So, carbon is the main kind of backbone component of the four macromolecules that we're going to talk about in this chapter that make up a lot of living things. I mean, like a large proportion of living things. Um, those four macromolecules that are based around carbon are proteins, lipids, which are fatty molecules, carbohydrates, which are sugar and related molecules, and nucleic acids, which is DNA and RNA. And all of those are built around carbon. So, carbon uh, is one of the major components of our bodies. We have a lot of water, we have a lot of carbon in our bodies, and the compounds that contain carbon are called organic compounds. If you've heard of organic chemistry, that is the study of chemicals that contain carbon, basically. And why is carbon so important in these molecules that are in our body, like the proteins, the lipids, the carbohydrates, and the nucleic acids? It's because they can form a lot of bonds really easily with other atoms. I'm sorry, like atoms of carbon can form bonds with up to four other atoms, and that is because carbon is number 6 on the periodic table. It has 2 electrons in the innermost electron shell. It has 4 electrons in its valence shell, and so each of those electrons can form a covalent bond with another atom. And so carbon can grab onto up to 4 other atoms at once. So it's really versatile, it's really flexible. I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. So I jokingly call these carbon's best friends. Carbon interacts a lot with hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And those are some of the most prevalent atoms in our body, right? Elements in our body. And you can see hydrogen has a valence of 1, meaning it has 1 electron in its outer shell. Oxygen has a valence, it has a valence of 1, meaning it has 1 electron in its outer shell and it needs 1. So when we say how many valence electrons does it have, that's how many are in the outer shell. When we say what is its valence, that's how many does it need. I don't know why they made that so confusing, but there you go. So hydrogen has a valence of 1 because it wants 1 electron. Oxygen has a valence of 2 because it wants 2 electrons. Nitrogen has a valence of 3 because it wants 3 electrons. And carbon has a valence of 4 because it wants 4 electrons. So let's talk about CO2. That is the gas that we breathe out. Not the only gas. Yeah, that's one of the gases that we breathe out, I guess. How many electrons do each of these atoms need to fill their outer shell? What is their valence? So we talked about this on the previous slide. It's the same number. So oxygen, both of the oxygens need 2, and carbon needs 4. So carbon can share 2 with each oxygen, and everyone will be happy. So carbon dioxide looks like this. They are double bonds, double covalent bonds. So you can see that each oxygen is sharing 2 of carbon's electrons with 2 of their own electrons, and so it's 8 electrons in the valence shells of all 3 of those atoms. Let's look at another one. So carbon and hydrogen interact together in molecules all the time. How many electrons does each atom need to fill its valence shell? Hydrogen needs 1, carbon needs 4. So how many hydrogens could bond to a carbon? You could get as many as 4. And a lot of times, especially in fats, which I'll show you what that looks like in a second, you end up with carbons binding together in a long chain and then hydrogens binding all around the edges. So you can see that the hydrogens around the outside are happy because they have 2 electrons in their valence shells. and the carbons in the middle are happy because they have 8 electrons in their valence shells, and so all of these atoms are in their most, we would say, like stable configuration. So again, that string of carbons with all the H's hanging off the side is a big component of fatty acids. So this is a kind of fat. So one of the groups we're going to talk about in upcoming videos is lipids. Lipids are fatty things. They are hydrophobic. They don't like water. And we'll talk more about why later on, but for now I just want you to see that there are 3 fatty acids in those yellowish rectangles. And can you see how those fatty acids are carbons with hydrogens hanging off of them? That's what we were just looking at in the slide before. Another group that we're going to talk about is the carbohydrates or the sugars. And I want to introduce you to this kind of diagram format if you haven't seen it before. When we have carbons that are arranged in a ring, sometimes we draw the ring and there's a carbon at each corner, but it just doesn't show you. So I think it's just to make it easier to draw. So if you look at that glucose monosaccharide, meaning one glucose sugar up in that upper left-hand corner, you see where the red O is in the corner? That's oxygen. But all the other corners of that hexagon have a carbon there that you just can't see because it's like a shorthand for writing the molecule. So carbon is also the backbone of carbohydrates or sugars, and it forms bonds with other carbons, and it also has hydrogens and OHs hanging off the side. So again, just carbon is the backbone of a lot of the molecules in our bodies, and we will, including those 4 categories that we talked about, and we will continue to look at the structure of a carbohydrate and the structure of a lipid and the structure of a protein and the structure of a nucleic acid as we go along, and they're all built around carbon. And see, it was useful that you learned all that chemistry because now it's related to things we care about in biology.